So you have the case that some categories of people, they see their own areas of freedom restricted, and the area of freedom of other people are expanding. And the second category are increasing their income, their riches, and the opposite is true. Now, to have time, I would like to address your attention to the study of a famous French anthropologist. She was called Germaine Tillon. The book is a very famous one, Tillon. Germaine Tillon, she studied, being an anthropologist, the situation in Ores. Ores is a small village in Algeria. Algeria was a colony, as we know, of France, south of the capital Algeria. And she went to study that situation in the year 130. And she discovered an homogeneous society, where more or less everybody was in the same situation. Very poor, but more or less the same. 20 years later, after the war, in 1950, she went back to Ores. And what did she observe? That there were 15–20% of the local population who had become very rich. And the remaining 80% of the population who had become poorer than when they were 20 years before. And she said, what happened? How to explain that? In 20 years' time. And she, in the book she wrote in the year 1950, she gave the reason. And the reason is the creation of pecuniary externality on the side of the French government in Paris, who in bona fide, what did, created a motorway, a sort of a motorway, linking Ores to Algeria, and bonified the countryside using DDT, because to fight against malaria. What was the result? That this opened new opportunities. And the people started, the clever people, to exploit the new opportunities in order to become richer. Because people stopped making crops, but they started cattle rearing, because they could use the motor car to bring meat from Ores to Algeria, because the price of meat in Algeria was much higher than they could afford locally. And so, 20% of the population could exploit the new opportunities. The other ones, and so the inequality increased. Now that is an interesting case, because you see the government did what he did in order to help the local population, and the opposite was true, etc., etc. So now, again, in this case, you have a situation where, in presence of pecuniary externality, you cannot avoid but making an explicit reference to it. Because, and in fact, the economist who, in my opinion, better than anybody else, made that clear was Schelling. Thomas Schelling, American, he got the Nobel Prize in economics already 10, 12, 14 years ago. And in his book, the Strategy of Conflict, where he described what he called pecuniary or positional externalities. And still it is a fact that most economists, most textbooks never talk about it. And still, that is the major determinant of inequality increases. So this is the second important case. Now you might tell me, why should we bother with inequality? Why? After all, isn't it important to fight against poverty? Why should we be concerned with it? The answer we know is that inequality is more dangerous than poverty, because inequality jeopardizes peace and democracy, as we know. Because you see, poor people, they do not make war. If you are poor, you cannot stand. You cannot make war. Those who make war are not the absolutely poor, but the relative poor. In other words, those who suffer because of inequality. And democracy is the same. Because you should look at what happens in our societies, even in the United States. People do not go any longer to vote. The democratic participation is going down. Why is it? Because you see, inequality is the enemy of the democratic participation. So that is why this issue is a really very serious one. And again, you cannot try to cope with, let's say, income redistribution, because that is not the issue. that it's an old-fashioned way of reasoning. You have to go back to the origin of the problem, and hence you have to cope with the ethical issue.